Chuck is going to talk to the theme of why can't Johnny be good, the making of an insider threat. Thanks, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Richard. I had this joke set up, but I'm not going to use it. Something about being the American imperialist legal guy. But so I want to start. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for staying for the last part. It's going to be really good. When Paul comes back, he's got a really exciting session. But I want to go over a couple of things that I've heard. So is David in the room? There's David. David talked about some of the problems with internal threats and breaches and the costs associated with recovering from those. Billy Hawks talked about how you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource accountability. Lorraine, is Lorraine still in the room? Lorraine had a very interesting perspective, and she actually gave me a little bit to add to my presentation about the way Apple treats people versus how I think corporations and companies treat people. Paul talked about how directors can be held accountable. There's a theme running through this, and it leads as a front end into my presentation. Mark Johnson talked about humans being the weakest link. And finally, James, is James still here? James left, but he demonstrated a number of the silly things that humans do. So what I'd like to do is take about 20 minutes and walk you through how you make an insider threat. Now, I'll tell you ahead of time, that for some of you, I'm going to probably make you a little mad, especially if you're on a board of directors or leading a company or a large organization. But I might scare you a little bit. You've been scared enough in the last couple of days. But I want to give you some insight. I'll make you think a little bit, and then the rest is up to you. But I'm taking a slightly non-technical. I'm not an expert on the technology behind protecting our networks and infrastructure, the cyber stuff. But here's some very interesting points. No one, on the very first day they show up to work for you, intends to do you harm. I really believe that. Think about the first day you showed up at work, at wherever you work. You wanted to save the world. You wanted to do good things. You didn't want to do that company harm. You didn't want to steal their data. You didn't want to defraud them of millions of dollars, as you'll see in a second. But something happens. And there was a study recently. It takes a number of years. It's not always overnight. But something happens either in their personal lives or in the work environment that causes them to hurt you. Sadly, and this is where maybe you might get mad, but I'm saying it's probably your fault. And I'll show you why. But there is something you can do. And again, I'll give you five suggestions at the end to maybe get you to think a little bit differently about when you go back in your workplaces. And for the people in the room that are in the business of doing what we do here, this is definitely going to give you a slightly different strategy. And hopefully, we heard a lot about getting the board engaged and getting leadership engaged in this, and that's exactly what this is about. So, and sadly, I know this is also a technology exposition, but what I'm going to tell you really has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with people, it has to do with humans. So I'll start off with an easy one. This young woman, Anne, she worked at a car repair in England, and she got mad with her boss. So she took a thumb drive, copied all the accounting files, erased them off the computer, stuck the thumb drive in her mattress at home. And it took them a couple months to recover. The police had to go out, dig the thumb drive out of the mattress. He did come back, but it cost them $50,000 to recover. This television program that plays in the US, this Michael Scott is interesting because he didn't work for the production company that made this show. He actually worked for a subcontractor, a cloud provider, if you will. Well, he got fired a month later from his parents' apartment, logged in, and wiped out 300 gigs of data. 2 years worth of work, 100 people. The whole idea of hiring this company was to back up their data, but the backups failed, so they completely lost it. This young man, Sam, worked for Gucci in New York City in finance. He logged in 6 months later. Now, I'm not going to, I know some of you are thinking, well, there's a lot of technical stuff back there that should have prevented this. But he was actually a system administrator, and he set up fake accounts, so he was able to log in 6 months later with one of his own tokens. And it caused about $200,000 in damage. Not a big deal. This young man, he was an entrepreneur. He worked for Bristol Myers Squibb, but he wanted to start his own pharmaceutical company. So he copied down about 45 gigs of data. In this case, the network guys caught it, and they ran a sting operation. He thought he was meeting with some people who were going to give him to get him started in India. Instead, it was an FBI guy who promptly arrested him. This guy, and I didn't get pictures of the other three, I couldn't find them, but these four guys, how many of you saw the movie Office Space, where they changed the software in the ATM and immediately had 300,000? Well, they did something like that to some funding at Columbia University and stole $6 million that was supposed to be funding some hospital stuff. They got caught. They were all in deep debt. They got caught as well. A little closer to home in my role in security, Doug was a subcontractor to the Transportation Security Administration. He was writing some code for the passenger screening system. He found out they were going to get rid of contractors, and he put a logic bomb in the software. Fortunately, it was on the development system, and before they moved the software to the production environment, someone caught it. And so he's no longer writing software for the government. And this is my favorite lady, Anna Montez. Anna was a clerk, low-level clerk, but didn't like the way America was treating Cuba. The Cuban intelligence service found out about her feelings about this and recruited her. And she was probably one of the only spies in recent history that worked her way up through the system and became the lead Cuban analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. And then there's this guy. Who recognizes him? Any other Americans in the room, or am I the token American? Nobody recognize him? How about now? Mr. Manning. Mr. Manning, to me, is a poster child for what we're doing wrong in protecting our systems, our intellectual property, our data. And I'm retired U.S. Navy, so I'm picking on the Army a little bit. But this is an exaggerated case. It's one of the worst cases, or it's the worst case ever. But I want you to think about some of the things that the Army did that you probably are doing in your organizations or in the client organizations that you're trying to help protect. So he was born in Oklahoma. His father was stationed in the Navy in Wales, met a young lady, married, moved back to the U.S. And the zipper is over here. Is Bill still in the room? I was going to say that he was a graduate of the Coder Dojo because he was building his first website at 10 years old. He was writing code by 13. He was a really smart kid. But he had a lot of problems. He was angry all the time. He'd fight with his parents. He'd throw things. He was a real handful. And there's a book out called Private now that you can read about more detail about him. But at age 13, he also started to question his own sexuality. And he was always, he was very anti-church and anti-politics. And he was one of those that would complain about anything that somebody liked. He'd say he didn't like it. But he had a lot of pain going on in his life. He was very small. He was only 5'2", so he was picked on a lot. This will come into play, especially when he goes back. His parents divorced. He moved back to Wales with his mother. And I guess they really did a job on him in the schools there because they picked on him all the time. They beat him up. He was a kid in a lot of pain. So in 2007, he really wanted a PhD in physics. And so his father, an ex-Navy man, said, hey, you should join the Army. You get a college degree. So he joins the Army, but he only lasted 6 weeks. And they sent him to the discharge unit. Well, somebody recycled him, as they called it, put him into the next class, and said no, he was destined to be an intelligence analyst. And so they said, no, we need intelligence analysts. We're short that skill. So let's recycle him again. We'll give him some counseling. We'll sit him down. We'll read him the Riot Act. They recycled him, and he graduated. So they sent to intelligence school at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. It's where all the Army trains all of their analysts there. While he was there, he actually posted up YouTube videos of what it was like to work in a sensitive, compartmented information facility. Are there any? Well, there must be a GCHQ or an MOD or someone intelligence in the audience that knows what a SCIF is. A SCIF is a place people are not supposed to know about. But he put up these YouTube videos, and he was scolded, but nothing really came out of it. But he talked about how wonderful it was to work all with this classified stuff. Then he went to Fort Drum, and he was getting ready for deployment to Iraq. What was really interesting about this was also the same time when he met his boyfriend. I'll come back to that in a second. But this was also the time when two of his superiors had said he's a risk to himself and others. Maybe he shouldn't go to Iraq. So what do you think the Army did? Sent him to Iraq. Fort Hammer, as they call it. He worked in a room that looked something like that, probably not as nice as that. Any of you that worked in a classified environment, you know, now there's windows, but there didn't used to be very many windows, and especially in a desert like that, you'd be in a closed room, no windows, the lights wouldn't be as bright as that, the computers are nowhere near as big as that. But it's a hell of an environment to spend 14 hours of your day. He also, another small point, he lived with he bunked with another Army mate, and this was the don't ask, don't tell era. And so he told his roommate, you know, hey, you know, I'm gay. Of course, that's now going to be on video, thank you. But what do you think his roommate said? Don't ever talk to me again. So how would you feel if you're living with this guy, you're in the same space, and so he's constantly being beaten down. His supervisors, they're in a hostile environment. They're Army guys. I'll tell you later. He got in a fight with one of them. He just was living this very terrible life. This was also in 2009 was when he made his first contact with WikiLeaks. He wasn't hiding this. Like you saw the protest poster earlier. He was actively marching in protests when he was back in the US. He posted on Facebook that he felt alone and hopeless. So this wasn't someone who was trying to hide the pain and what was going on in his head. In January, he traveled back to the US and he went to a party at Boston University. Bill's was a hacker lab that they had built at Boston University, and that's where he got introduced to the hacker community, and also a gentleman I'm going to show you a picture of in a second. But it was also during that period that he dressed up as a woman, and he went out in the town and partied on the town in Boston dressed up as a woman and took pictures of himself. Then he emailed the pictures to his master sergeant explaining that he was having this gender identity issue. Another time he was found curled in the fetal position. Now realize, if you had someone that was behaving this way and he was a high-value employee in your organization, would you leave him in that, or her in that position? They still didn't remove him. So finally the psychiatrist said, and he's been seeing psychiatrists and counselors all along in this whole time. And so finally the psychiatrist said, okay, we need to get him out of there. He's an occupational problem. That was kind of interesting. And they sent him to a supply office, but they didn't pull his clearance. In May, he revealed to this mathematician in Boston that he was the one that released the collateral murder video. How many of you have seen the video of the Army helicopter supposedly killing terrorists? Turns out it was a news crew. A guy carrying a camera, they thought it was an RPG. The fog of war, as they say. But he was the one that released that to WikiLeaks. It was also, 2 days later, he began chats with Adrian Lamore, who was an ex-hacker. I don't know a lot about the gentleman. I imagine some of you may have heard of him. But he was the one that finally turned him in to the FBI. All told, he released 750,000 documents to WikiLeaks, and you've seen news press about the release of those, the diplomatic cables. the Army history files. So, what went wrong? I'll take the classic approach first. The classic thing would be to look at these three perspectives. Some of you have seen this. There's a document on the FBI website you can download today. It has all of these in it. So we'll look at the personal factors. Was it a greed or a financial need? Was he angry and revenge? Yeah, I mean, the whole world was against him. The Army was doing stuff he didn't believe in. They weren't dealing with the problems. Was it ideology? Yes. Was it divided loyalty? Probably not. I mean, you could read through these. Family problems? Definitely. So how many of these indicators would you have to have go off before you thought to yourself, I'm not sure this is the kind of person I want to put in a position of trust and responsibility? You know, would you trust this person with your stuff? Organizational factors. How easy was it for him to access the information? He actually downloaded a search tool onto the secret network. I don't know how he did that, and I lived in that environment for 30 years. Were there undefined policies? Of course not. How many times do you think he received his security training? When you get your security clearance, you're briefed in. You receive annual refreshers. They got signs posted all over the place. Insufficient training? Absolutely not. I mean, he was trained. And then the behavioral factors. Was he looking for information outside his normal duties? Yes. You know, was there excessive remote access to the network? Probably not, because it was a secret network. It was a closed network. Did he disregard security policies? Yes. Was there unexplained affluence? No. He wasn't a money thing. Did he have suspicious personal contacts? When he went to Boston to go to the Bills Center, that should have been a sign as well. Overwhelmed with life crises. I mean, you could see these are the kinds of classic things. But what I ask you today is, what is the missing factor in all of this? What is the one thing that none of that analysis looks at? Where's leadership's responsibility? How many chances did they have to get rid of him? How many chances do you have to get rid of the insider threats or the problem children that you may have in your organizations? Oh, he's not that bad. I'll talk to him. They're called signs. You know that old, you might be a redneck if, but you might be an insider threat if you have some of those indicators. So, but this is the big problem right here. Look. This was a study, a Pricewaterhouse study with Iron Mountain. Look who they think, I think this was 2,000 people interviewed. Who is ultimately responsible for information security, information risk? Nearly 60% of the people think it's the IT and security people. Who is ultimately responsible for protection of intellectual property in your organization? Paul said it yesterday. The board, the CEOs, the directors. Only 13% thought the top guys were responsible. So we got to change that. We manage tangible assets. I bet you have to have a property pass to carry out a laptop or something from your organization, and it's got a barcode on it, and someone goes around twice a year and scans them. So you treat your tangible assets, you treat your cash flow as crown jewels. But how do you treat your people? And so this is where I'll inject what Lorraine said. Lorraine's not in the room. Lorraine left. But Lorraine talked about Apple. And she talked about how Apple treats people, customers in that regard, as humans. How do you treat your people? Staff. Apple tries to build loyalty. What do most organizations try to build? Compliancy. Right? You have compliance training, don't you? Annual compliance training you have to go through. So, I have 5 questions. This is the first one. And a lot of this is built, some of these thoughts behind the next 5 questions you'll see. For those of you that may have studied psychology, if you remember B.F. Skinner, conditioned response. Well, there's a gentleman that studied under B.F. Skinner, and he created a solutions framework so that if the dog didn't hit the lever to get his food, what would you do? And so some of this is, first question is, do your employees really, really understand what you expect of them? Job performance-wise, what about dealing with personnel issues? In my own career in the Navy, in 1980, I had a chief, and if I had a problem with pay or finance or health or my wife or kids, I went to the chief. When I retired by 1997, there's a website for that. You know, you go to the HR website and you do whatever you need to do.
Just ignore it.
Want to let him in? Security responsibilities, you probably sit down and they have to sign a paper that says, you know, you're being entrusted with this information, you will take care of it. So that's probably covered. But the next thing is, do they have what they need to do what you expect? How many times do they circumvent security because it's too hard to do something? I was working with NATO, I'm still working with NATO, and they have these secure laptops. And the system guy showed me this new, you know, Windows to Go. How many of you know about Windows to Go? It's Windows on a USB stick. You can stick this in any computer and it opens up a protected Windows environment. You can do whatever you want. So they're creating a similar for their secure networks. And I said, but the users still have to log in 3 times because you got to log into the BitLocker, and then you got to log into the operating system, and then you have to log into the VPN that connects them to their back-end email. You think they're going to use the protected network, or are they going to take their email, use their webmail browser, and forward the email to their Yahoo or Gmail account so that they can use their email outside without having to go through the security stuff? Tools and materials, degrees of freedom in their job. When's the last time you really were in touch with the morale and welfare of the people? You know, managing by walking around. Do you really know your people? What kind of problems are they having? Do you hold your lower level managers responsible to know that someone has starting to have a financial problem? Or like, was it Ames that, you know, he was a high grade the CIA spy. He was driving around in a Jaguar. At the time, it wasn't exactly a car that the typical government employee was driving around in. How well do you know your people? This is a big one, especially in the economy, downsizing, right-sizing. Do you factor in the potential for insider threats as you right-size your organizations? I have an organization now, literally, your position's going away. You need to go find a job. And I had a person come to me the other day saying, hey, do you have any room on your team? How would you feel if you lost your jobs and you had to walk the halls looking for an opening somewhere in the organization? I mean, that's pretty tough. Line leadership, looking at the personal factors. How well are you really in touch? If you're up at the boardroom level, how many times do you go just hang out in the cafeteria or go out on a smoke break and fake like you smoke and just talk to the people and see what's going on? I mean, I think we're really out of touch with some of that. Finally, what are we doing about it? Is the CEOs taking responsibilities? Are the directors taking responsibility for information security, for taking care of their people? How do you actively develop a sense of loyalty? And I have a test for you. You can use this if you want. I think the best test of testing the loyalty of your employees is asking them one question. Would you recommend your job to a friend? Would you recommend working for this company to someone else? And if the answer to that is not yes, absolutely, that person could be planning something. I don't know if I included the slide here, but that same study showed the growth of an insider threat in the financial sector. It took 3 to 5 years for that person to figure out that they were going to do something. It took them another year to plan it. And so it might take 3, 5, 6 years for someone to actually do you harm. So this is not something you just pop in once a day. You have, just as you watch your cash flow and your stock prices you need to be watching your employees and making sure that, I'm not saying they all have to be happy. I mean, we had a saying in the Navy, a bitching sailor is a happy sailor. So, but make sure that if they're used to complaining, that they don't go quiet on you. If they go quiet on you, you better start worrying. And then finally, well, I talked about managing by walking around. If you're staying in your office, you're not walking around the organization. I do another seminar on espionage, and I asked the CEOs, how many of you have walked through your organization as if you were your competitor? What would you see? What would you have access to? How easy is it to do a trash cover and just take a bag of trash out the door? What do you see on the bulletin boards in your organization? If you're not walking around once in a while and seeing how things are going, you're probably leaving yourself open to risk. And then, of course, there's the good technical measures. The firewalls, the routers, intrusion detection, all of that. So if you think it won't happen to you, this is the same study. 2,031 European workers were surveyed. 1 in 3 admitted that they had taken or forwarded confidential information out of the office. 1 in 3 out of these 2,000. Europeans, these are not Americans. I don't know what the numbers are in America. 1 in 7 had taken confidential information with them to a new job. Is that a loyal employee? No way. And you know the old saying, right? It's much more expensive to fire someone and hire a new person than it is to try to turn around an employee that you have. And finally, 31% said they would deliberately remove and share confidential information if they were fired. So if nothing else, if you fire someone, if you have to fire someone, make sure that they don't have access to your network or that they don't have a social network. The Gucci guy actually called his friend back at Gucci and talked him into activating that VPN token that he had left the back door on. Bottom line is, if you want Johnny to be good, you got to spend more time on Johnny. You got to do the human side of it. The technical side is just not enough. And compliance over commitment. You know, you want them doing the right thing when you're not watching them. That's commitment. That's not compliance. School's out. Thank you very much.